Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 75 in the series. I never really thought about this when I started, that I would get to 75, but it seems like some kind of milestone. Pretty happy about that. So welcome, it's lovely to see you guys here. I am filming on Sunday, which just happens to be Easter Sunday for some. I know we're in the middle of Passover. I know Greek Easter is next Sunday, so there's lots of holidays going on, all amidst this crazy pandemic that we're having. I don't know about you, but I found it a little bit hard to concentrate lately. I podcasted, I guess it was 3 weeks, I was gonna say years, 3 weeks ago, right at the start of the Illinois lockdown, and everything was transitioning and it was all kind of like new and crazy, and now it's just crazy. So I hope you all are faring well, and it's lovely to see you if you're coming back. And if you are new here, this is a podcast mostly about knitting, modifications, pattern design, DIY, all that kind of good stuff, a little bit of spinning thrown in from time to time. I am broadcasting from Urbana, Illinois, where I'm a professor at the university there. We are teaching online, yes. So the last time I cast, I had taught one class online. Now I've taught, I think 3 or 4 sessions of the grad class online. It's going well. My grad students are super sweet. They are willing, they are able, and they have jumped on this and done a wonderful job. So that's made my life a lot easier. I really feel for my colleagues who have to teach, they're teaching undergrad classes that are, you know, upwards of like 35 students, 100 students. That is no mean task to put that kind of stuff online at a moment's notice. So yeah. So if you guys are wondering, how are we doing? We're doing okay. We've got a garden going, a pandemic garden going, which has taken up a lot of Spencer's time. Spencer's my husband, for those of you who are just tuning in now and maybe haven't watched previous episodes. He is a huge gardener, big green thumb guy, and so he's been out there turning sod, irrigating, planting, getting the garden all ready for us. So we just planted some frost hardy stuff yesterday, and he has been the master of like the starts in the kitchen. So we have tomatoes and peppers, and the squash are getting to be like massive in the kitchen. I think we planted them a little bit too early. And we did plant a round of fruit trees to kind of help our orchard, which is a little bit older. So we've been just kind of like hunkering down, doing a little bit of pandemic gardening and lots of knitting and cooking and things like that. So we're doing all right. I hope you guys are doing okay. And I hope that this little cast can kind of be a bright light in your weekend or your weekday whenever you get a chance to watch it. Okay, so what do I have for you for the cast today? Well, I have a finished object. This is Meltdown, well, my version of Meltdown. I'll talk about that. I have a few thank yous to some folks out there who have been going above and beyond. I want to make sure I mention them. And I want to talk a little bit about knitting intuition. So I think that's what I'm calling this episode, is knitting intuition. It's something that I learned from a lot of knitting and from talking to designers and other knitters around the world, especially people who have been knitting like their entire lives. They have quite a bit of knitting intuition, and I bet a bunch of you have a lot of knitting intuition. So maybe we'll start up a little Ravelry thread about that as we get on to the topic. And then I have a wonderful giveaway from Noyes of Ranching Tradition Fiber. And in fact, her yarn is the yarn I used for this sweater, so we're going to talk all about it. So I'm going to jump in with a couple of thank yous. First off, I wanted to say thank you to both Alicia and Linda for their recent Ko-fi donations. Thank you, you guys, along with everyone else who has donated, are keeping the wheels of this podcast running with postage and the ability to get some things to show you guys and all that kind of good stuff. So thank you so much, Alicia and Linda. I wanted to say a quick thank you too to Kathy. Kathy and I did a little exchange a while back. She was making some Christmas ornaments, and she bought some shorn yarn, and I sent her some fiber for her Christmas ornaments, some wool, and she sent along a couple of skeins of yarn, because a while ago I asked if any indie dyers out there wanted to make some, like, Spencer his own colorway. So Kathy came up with these two. These are not exclusively Spencer colorways, but she named them as such, and I thought it was really sweet. This is Black Forest by Primrose Yarn Company, and she called it Spencer's Black Forest. It's a beautiful sock weight yarn. And she also sent along some yarn from lamb strings, and I've wanted to try lamb strings for a very long time, and so I'm kind of excited about either casting this on or getting Spencer to cast it on so we can kind of check it out. I have some mohair just hanging out over here. This is what happens when you're in the yarn room. Mohair just appears and like sticks to you. So this is lamb strings Walk the Plank, and she called it Spencer's Walk the Plank. Thought it was quite beautiful. So Kathy, thank you for sending these along. Either Spencer or I will definitely be knitting something up in these to keep ourselves busy. Spencer's been working on some hat designs actually, so maybe he'll go for some fingering weight yarn in a hat. I don't know. You never know with Spencer. And the last shout out I wanted to give is to Nancy of the Round Rabbit podcast. And Nancy is an amazing sewist. She actually makes beautiful project bags. This is one of her project bags that I snagged from her shop. Maybe like about 3 or 4 months ago, she had these up. She kind of constantly rotates her stock in her shop and everything. But Nancy was kind enough. She lives out in New York near my hometown, and we've been friends for a while. And when all this pandemic stuff was going on, I asked her, my mom really wanted to get some masks because she takes care of my grandma who's 80, and they have 2 separate households, but she's been kind of going back and forth, and the dogs are going crazy as usual. So she's been going back and forth between like grocery stores and my grandma's house, and she just wanted to make sure that she was kind of extra safe. So she was asking me for masks, and I can't sew for anything. You guys know that. I have no sewing ability. But I know Nancy's been making masks for a lot of people in her community, and she's really close by my mom. So I just sent her a quick message and said, Nancy, would you be willing to make her a mask? And I think Nancy sent her like 2 or 3 masks just out of like the good kindness of her heart. So thank you so much, Nancy, for taking care of my mom in my absence. You guys are all the way over in New York. It seems like it once was very close, but now seems very far. So thanks for taking care of my mom and my grandma. I appreciate it very much, and using your sewing skills for good for lots of other people who you've been helping out. So thank you. And our dogs are, if you guys haven't watched the podcast, our dogs are 2 sister dogs who are barking right now. I'll probably have to go settle them down. But we adopted Tink about almost 3 years ago now, and then we ended up adopting her sister a year after that. So they are quite rambunctious. They're almost 3 and they're really adorable, but they are a handful sometimes. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you guys about today is knitting intuition. And when we get to this sweater, I think you'll hear a little bit more about it. But one of the things that's been really interesting for me in the last couple of years has been working with Albina of LB Hand Knits, because when we started working on sweater designs and test knits and all kinds of things together, she and I had very different ways of going about knitting. And partially it was because she has been knitting since she was just a little kid, and she has a longer experiential like history of knitting, and she has her own kind of like ways of doing it without necessarily turning to patterns or like going line by line on things. And when I started working with her, I think it was about 2017 or 2018 maybe. So I had been knitting for maybe 5 or 6 years at that point. I was just getting into sweaters. I hadn't yet designed a sweater myself from the beginning to the end, though I had modified a lot of patterns. But I was very much a pattern knitter, and I relied on the patterns, and I was learning how to modify based on the patterns that I was working on. So I was kind of coming at this from a very different perspective, like as someone who hadn't been knitting my whole life, but was learning it through the patterns that I was knitting, on how to modify them, what the sweater math looked like, all that kind of stuff. And I have to say that when we talked about it, she said that she's much more of an intuitive knitter, and she would kind of knit and think about what she wanted the shapes to look like and how she wanted the increases to work, and what the thing would become was like this organic thing in her mind, and she could do so without needing a pattern to follow. Meanwhile, I was at that time reading line by line on the patterns, notching my marks, keeping my row counts, all those things that I think especially new knitters do, because we're nervous about missing a step, or we're nervous about messing something up that can't be fixed later, right? Because knitting is one of those things where you pile those rows on top of each other, and it's really not always that easy to go back. So I have to say, I've been knitting now for, I want to say 8 or 9 years, and designed some patterns, done a lot of sweater math, done tons of modification with these patterns. And as I hope you guys have kind of heard from me in the past, I don't know, 10, 15 episodes, you kind of get in the swing of things eventually. And I learned by modifying patterns, so working backward to see what their expectations were based on gauge and what their final numbers looked like, to figure out how my gauge could be different or how I could modify something if I wanted to change it. And now I feel a little bit more like I understand where Albina was coming from when I first talked to her all those years ago, because as I'm knitting a sweater like this one, which I'll talk about in a second, I didn't necessarily panic if things weren't quite right. I had 4 skeins of yarn, and I was just kind of like, we're gonna make this work. So it'll be a little different than the pattern. So we'll make some changes here or there or whatever, but it'll work out. And things like deciding on when I had to go back and fix the my gauge was wrong and I had to go back and fix the increases that I did. You kind of have a sense, you do a little math just to check yourself, but I had a sense of like, well, no, I'm gonna actually need an extra couple of stitches here or there. So for example, in the armpits, I took out 4 of the stitches that she had in her pattern because my gauge was different than hers. And then I thought to myself, well, but I need to pick up a couple of those stitches up here just in case, you know, I need to have that going on. So I did that as I was knitting. I was kind of like, I'm gonna add a little here, I'm gonna add a little there. Or when I encountered the difference between the skeins of yarn, I was like, I'm not gonna panic or pull everything out. I'm just gonna do a little fadey, kind of like swapping skeins just for a couple of rows, and it'll work out. And when I was doing the, I'll talk about this in a second, but when I was doing the collar work even, I didn't go with a provisional cast on. I just decided to kind of like knit 2 together, whipping things together, and it worked out just fine. So I feel like I'm getting it finally. I can tell you 8 or 9 years in that when I knit a sweater like this, there's some sweater math, but there's also this sense of like intuitively it's gonna be fine. I kind of have a sense of how these things work. If you've knit enough yoked sweaters, you're like, okay, this is about the point when I would do X, but in this case I'm gonna do Y. So I have to give a little shout out to Albina here for kind of leading the way on this one and showing me how it's possible to, I really didn't believe her at the time. Not that I didn't believe her, but I was just kind of like amazed at the time that she could just intuitively say, oh, well, I've just, you know, as I'm knitting, I see the fabric and I think about what I want it to do. And you get to a point where that actually can happen. So I'd love to hear from the rest of you guys if you are intuitive knitters or pattern knitters, or if you're kind of like working in between both of them. I know with Albina, as she became more of a pattern writer, we talked a lot about that transition for her was maybe as wild as the transition for me to go more intuitive. So I think between the two of us, you have those 2 trajectories kind of like intermingling and meeting in the middle, which is a wonderful thing. So I'd love to hear from you guys if you guys feel like you're intuitive knitters or if you feel like you're pattern-based knitters. Let me know. We'll open up a Ravelry thread and we can have a little chat about it, especially in the pandemic when maybe we need some things to talk about with knitting and it soothes us and it's a wonderful thing to be doing. So with that said, I think I'll switch over to talking about this guy for you guys. So let's switch over to finished objects, and what I have today is Meltdown by Tantem, and that's Tanteehm. I'll put the name down here so that you can find it over on Ravelry. It's a beautiful pattern for a top-down yoked sweater that goes with this kind of like ombre faded kind of a thing going on. And I was actually looking for a pattern for some beautiful yarn that Cami Noyes of Ranching Tradition Fiber sent over. We were talking one day about her new line of yarn, which is the Tobacco Root Valley yarn. And it's a beautiful new line of yarn that's a DK weight, and it's dyed like all these beautiful colors of the rainbow. And she's had a couple designers design sweaters specifically for the yarn. But I was talking to her about the yarn, and she sent me some to try and to give away on the podcast. So when I opened this box, it was like bursting with all the colors of her yarn, and she sent me a skein of each of her entire line of tobacco root yarn. And as I was looking at the yarn, I kind of had it all laid out on the table, and I was like, how am I going to, like, I want to make something out of this that's really going to show off the yarn and that's really going to take advantage of all her different colorways. And I noticed among all the colors that there were these 3 beautiful blues and natural. And I thought, as I kind of ordered all the yarn on the table, they just kind of came together in this perfect little palette. And I was like, oh, that is really, really pretty. And I would say that there was one other option and for the palette that I was considering, and I would say it's this one. So I'm going to be showing you lots of Cammie's yarn today. But this was the other palette I considered, and I'm not sure, I'm trying to figure out how to show you guys this. So the other kind of ombre fade could be something like this, to go from a brown to over here on this end to a kind of beautiful green to a lighter green to a white. And that was the other potential fade that I considered. But I decided to go with the blue. So let me tell you a little bit about the sweater, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about Cammie's yarn. So this sweater is, as I said, meant to be a kind of like faded ombre kind of a thing. And it has this nifty panel here on the side, and I think part of that is to distract the eye. Like sometimes when you have kind of broad stripes on a sweater, horizontal stripes, visually it does some interesting things to whoever's wearing it. Like the vertical stripes are slimming, and horizontal stripes can kind of make things look wider. And so I think that this detail kind of brings the whole sweater together, so that there's less chunky horizontal stripe, and that's not just what you're seeing, but you're seeing this kind of nice visual breakup of the yarn colors and those bigger horizontal stripes. It's a nice detail, it's kind of cool. And you create it by working this purl panel on the bias, basically. So you're doing a decrease and then an increase, and you're slipping a stitch so that you're creating this nifty line, which I hope comes out on the camera. So as I was knitting this, I had 4 skeins of yarn. I had the slate, I had Madison, I had Big Sky, and I had the natural. And I kind of did the math, and I thought, I bet I can get away with making the sweater out of just the 4 skeins of yarn. Yeah, I would have gotten very, very close, but not totally able to do it. And so I considered making it a version of this, like in a vest, bottom up, just something very different. And in the end, I was like, no, I really kind of want a 3/4 length sweater that takes advantage of as much of the yarn as possible. So I ended up writing to Cammie, and I ordered 3 more skeins of yarn. That's the thing. Sometimes people will send yarn for a giveaway and for a testing, and then I end up just ordering more yarn from them because I absolutely love the yarn and I want to finish whatever project I'm working on. These are the perils of my job. My second job as a podcaster. So this, in the end, took 4 skeins of yarn plus half of two more skeins. So these 2 colors I needed an extra half skein for. So that's not super much. That's not a lot of yarn for a sweater. And I think that's kind of par for the course for the DK weight yarn. So what did I do to modify the sweater? Lots of things, because that's what I do. So it starts up here with this turned collar, and you'll notice that all of the hems on the sleeves, on the bottom hem, and on the collar are turned, which gives it a really kind of clean, finished look, I think. And up here, you're supposed to start with a provisional cast on. I have to say, I'm not the hugest fan of provisional cast ons because I've never mastered the crochet version, because I'm terrible at crochet. I just cannot. If you saw me trying to do crochet, you would laugh and you would just be like, wow, how can you possibly handle 2 knitting needles and not 1 crochet hook? I can't tell you, but I can't do it. Just like I can't sew. It's just like one of those things. I can hand sew, but not with a machine. So we each have our limits. So you're supposed to start with a provisional cast on. And I didn't, because I just don't really dig the provisional cast on thing. So I was like, I can just make it work. I've done it before on the chimney sweaters and other sweaters. So what I did is, knit one direction, did my purl turn row, turned it, and then knit, continued to knit until I had enough to be able to fold the fabric. And I folded it, and I just went through and I picked up stitches as I went through and just knit them together. So I knit 2 together all the way around, and it worked just fine. No provisional cast on needed. Then as I went down, I modified, because of my gauge, I modified the number of increases that I did. And actually I totally messed up because I did a tiny little gauge swatch. I was so excited to get going on the sweater. I did a tiny little gauge swatch and mismeasured my gauge, of course, because it was a tiny gauge swatch that wasn't enough. And I knew it, and I was just like trying to, you know, I've been knitting a lot of sweaters where I haven't needed to do a gauge swatch because I've been using the same yarn that I've been using over and over again. Anyway, bad move, because I got all the way down to this far into the body and realized that my gauge was off by enough that I had added 4 inches to the body of the sweater. So I ripped it all back. Ripped it all the way back up to here, redid my last round or 2 of increases so that I would end up with a 36-inch bust instead of a 40-inch bust. And from there, I was dealing with only having 4 skeins of yarn, because I was waiting for my other skeins to show up, and I was dealing with the fact that my row gauge was not exact for the pattern. So my fade, my melt here and here and here is slightly different than the melt in the pattern. I just went with a single, a double, and a single, as opposed to a 3-layered kind of melt, and I think it works just fine. It meant I could use a little less yarn, and it meant that I could adjust my rows for the height of the sweater, because I knew that I wanted this part of the sweater from the underarm down to the bottom to be longer than 13 inches that's called for in the pattern. So in order to do that, you've got to think about proportion, and you got to think about like how many inches you've got for each one to make sure that it comes out proportionally right. So I ended up doing I bet on about 5 inches for each of these sections, and then that meant as I got down to the white, which I knew would be the natural at the bottom, I didn't want to have a big 5-inch white section at the bottom because I just think proportionally it doesn't work very well. So this section is 2.5 inches. These are 5, and this one's a little bit bigger because it does have the neckline, but it comes out proportionally to about 5. If you measure from just below the neckline to where the first fade is. So that was the only tricky part, except that, you know, over here, these 5 inches are accounted for up above the armpit, and so I had to kind of take that into account. Anyway, a little bit of maths, a little bit of sweater maths. Don't be afraid of sweater maths. They're your friend. They can help you do all kinds of fun modifications and things. And then for the sleeves, I decided to I knew I wanted to go with 3/4 length sleeves, and so those will they hit about here. I'll put some pictures in here of me wearing the sweater so that you can actually see it. But with the sleeves, I had to be careful that I ended up with the same proportion, right, from the body over into the sleeve. So that's what I did, and I ended up with the 3/4 length sleeves, which is absolutely fine. If you wanted to make the sleeves longer, you don't have to make the body longer. You would just need to make each section of the collar just slightly longer, and I don't think you'd notice that when you were actually wearing it. It wouldn't be too jarring at all. So that's just a choice that I made. And I left all my decrease markers in so that you could see them. I often do my decrease markers this way. I will put a decrease in, mark it with a little pin, and then if I'm measuring between them, usually depending on the pattern, you can kind of do the math to see what they were thinking for the decreases, whether it's every inch, 2 inches, something like that. You figure out how many rows, and then you do the math to figure out, based on their gauge and your gauge, how many inches that is. So for this one, it's about 2.5 inches, and so I'd leave a little marker in for myself after I put in each of the decreases. And I put a few extra decreases as I got down to the sleeve, you can see. These were more like 1.5 inches, and then 1 inch and 1 inch apart, proportionally. But that brought the sleeve down size-wise just right at about, just on my forearm or so. But if I put these in, what that means is I don't have to count rows, I don't have to do like slashes on a wall or anything to know where I am in the pattern. And it means that I can duplicate it on the other sleeve. So if I leave my markers in, and then I go to my other sleeve, I can see about where I put those markers in relative to the color work and relative to how much space is in between them as I go down the sleeve. So that's how I just kind of do knitting without having to worry too much about counting rows or keeping track of actual rounds in the pattern. You just kind of like, this is onto that intuitive knitting bit, right? You use your markers so that you don't have to write anything down. It's like you just read your knitting and you read your markers, and then it's all right there. It's like a code in your sweater. What else did I do? I think you can see it down here. I didn't do, you're supposed to leave a plain stockinette, about 8 rows at the bottom, before you turn the hem. And I didn't do that. I just let the purl bias run all the way right into the hem, and then I just turned it there. And I kind of like that because I think it preserves the fun of this, this line down here. And I don't, as I haven't washed this yet, but I steam ironed it so that I'd be able to show you on the podcast. And I think it's laying just nice and flat and absolutely fine. There's no problem with it. I don't think you needed to do the extra stockinette at the bottom, and I just didn't feel like it. Speaking of steam ironing, if you ever need to quickly kind of like relax a knit after you've knit it, like you're like, oh my gosh, I'm just finishing this sweater and I need to put it on for, you know, we're going out to the game and I need to put it on and I want to wear it. You can use a wet towel and an ironing board. So you lay your sweater out on the ironing board, get the towel nice and wet, put it on top of the sweater, just single layer, and then run your hot iron over the towel. And the steam, the heat of the iron will turn the water on the towel like into hot, steamy stuff, and that will relax your stitches and kind of help your hems to lay nice and flat and all that kind of stuff. I used it especially for this on the collar, the yoke, and then on this bottom seam and on this purl panel to kind of get it to all lay nice and flat for you guys. I think I will probably give this a bath at some point, but at the same time, it's kind of just lovely the way it is, and I may not want to give it a bath right now. Let me show you the back of it. The back is where all of the color jogs are hidden. These I didn't bother doing this special color jog to keep it from doing the technique so that you don't get a color jog. I was just like, yeah, it's in the back, it's no problem. But down here you can definitely see that you can't see those color jogs at all because of the variegation in the yarn. And one thing I will say about using hand-dyed yarn, especially from indie dyers, like this is the, like I said, the Ranching Tradition Fiber Cami Noyes yarn, is that you've got to alternate skeins. So for me, I was doing the body with just these 4 skeins, and then when I got my extra skeins, I used those for the sleeves. Now you can probably see that this blue is a little more electric than this blue, even though they're the same colorway. And over here, you can probably see this blue is a little more electric than this blue, for example. So this is the same, this is this new skein that I got, and that's the older skein. Now in a sweater like this, it's not a problem because it's already got the stripes, and I worked it so that, you know, I did a little bit of this color fading in between those two. And so I don't think you'd ever actually notice. And over here, I did the color fading between the skeins that I had of this color, just to make sure that this lighter version kind of bled a little bit into the darker version. Again, I don't think you would notice it. And as long as you're alternating skeins and kind of like making it work with what you're working with for the pattern, it's all cool, and it's just something you have to be aware of. So with a pattern like this, I didn't worry about it because I knew I was already going for chunky blocks of color, and I would do a little fade into them as I got to the different changes. But if I were knitting a whole sweater using, say, like this color or this color, I would definitely alternate skeins as I was going around. So I do a round in one skein and do like either you can do a simple swap like I did here, or you can do the helical knitting method where you, I think you slip a few stitches so you end up kind of like creating this helix of knitting, and you're kind of going around like this. But in both cases, what you're doing is switching one round with one skein, one round with another skein, and some people even rotate in 3 different skeins at once to make sure that they're getting a nice variation of the color, and you're not going to get any weird color pooling or anything like that. So it's just a trick for if you're working with independently dyed, hand-dyed, kind of small batch yarn. Just a good thing to do. Anything else I want to mention about this sweater? I'm trying to think. I think that was probably all my modifications. I do a lot of modifications. But you've seen up at the pictures in the podcast, so you can see them, and I've got my project page over on Ravelry if you want to read a little bit more about what I did and how I did it. Let me show you some of the yarn I used. So, in case you're interested in Cami's yarn, these, as I said, were some of the skeins, because I used a whole skein of this, and I don't have any left. I have like a tiny little bow tie left of this. So those are the yarns that I used, and they just looked beautiful together. I couldn't help myself. This one, that's the most variegated of all of them, has a little bit of this, and a little bit of this, and even a little bit of this in it. So it's kind of like the perfect blend, and you can even see it in the sweater. It has the real dark bits that are up here, and it has the kind of like midway bits that are in here, and it has the little bits of white down here. So it's just kind of like, it's like a perfect kind. I don't know what, I mean, this just, I feel like it fell in my lap. I was just like, oh my God, that's so perfect together. So each skein of Cammy's yarn is, let's see, what's the actual, I think it's 3.4 ounces. Yes, about 3 ounces, a little over 3 ounces, and 250 yards, and it's a DK weight yarn. So this is the sage color, and I already showed you these beautiful greens and browns. And they're dyed for, they're all grown in Montana. Cammy is a 5th generation rancher out there, and she raises largely Targhee Rambouillet, and she's a big proponent. She started her flock with a bunch of bum lambs, lambs that were like rejected by their moms. So she went around her community and bought these bum lambs from other ranchers, and then brought them home, bottle fed them, and used them to kind of build up her own flock of sheep. And if you like merino, you would love Targhee Rambouillet. It has its own sproing to it, is the best way I can say it, and I find it to just be a joy to work with. This yarn, this is the Tobacco Root Valley yarn, it's a 2-ply, and I'll show you there. I think you'll be able to see it. It's a 2-ply yarn, and a DK weight, and it comes in like so many pretty colors. So I showed you all of the greens. These are some of the beautiful kind of reds, oranges, yellows. She has a gorgeous kind of like a goldenrod color. What's it called? What's the actual name? The names are all really great. This one's called Rye, the yellow, this beautiful golden. And then the purple is called Larkspur, of course. I like those two. I'm going to use these to make a little colorwork project that I'll show you on another episode later on. So for the giveaway, I've got 6 skeins of yarn to give away. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to do 2 groups because they're such pretty colors together. So this is one group, which has the beautiful kind of sage, the darker brown, which is called cone, and the green, which is called fur. So that'll be one prize. Beautiful. And then the other prize will be these 3 lovelies. And this is chokecherry, fall ash, and sumac, which are all really beautiful colors. So we're going to do 2 winners. And because unfortunately shipping has been affected by this pandemic thing going on, so I can only do domestic shipping. Sorry guys, I know I try to do international whenever I can, but I can't get to the post office, and it's not going to happen. So if you want to enter to win, please be in the United States and leave a comment here and let me know which color of Cammy's yarn you like the best, because there are so many to choose from. I'll leave a little link to her website so that you can head over and check out the Tobacco Root Valley yarn. And let us know which color you like the best. Over there, when you're over there, you can also check out a few other things. So here's Cammy, by the way. She was one of the first folks, indie farmer, rancher folks who agreed to do an interview with me on the blog back in 2015 when I was just getting started. So she has a special place in my heart. And this yarn that she's producing, as I said, is all Montana raised and produced and milled. But Cammy also runs the Copper Cave Fiber Festival, so you can find out information about that when you're over on her blog. And this year it's supposed to run July 18th and 19th, and they're kind of just keeping up with all the news and whether or not they'll be able to do it, but you can sign up to go to the Copper Cave Festival, and I know that they're just trying to give out as much information and get as many people out there as they can if it's safe to do so. So I know she's very aware of all the social distancing stuff and everything, but she does run the Copper Cave Fiber Festival, which happens every summer out in Montana, and I have wanted to go for years. We usually go backpacking out there, and I keep trying to figure out times of year that like being able to go backpacking and then still go to the fiber festival at the same time. So someday, maybe probably not this pandemic summer, but someday I will get out there to do some backpacking and some fibering, which would be truly awesome. So that's about it for today. It's been great to spend some time with you guys to talk about some finished objects and some farm to skein yarn from Ranching Tradition Fiber and some knitting intuition. So I hope you all have a safe, warm, wonderful place to be during this pandemic. And remember, we do have a thread going on over in the Ravelry group if you're doing some making in the meltdown here, making in the pandemic. Lots of people have been posting over there, and it's become quite a little community for sharing and talking and chattering, and head over there if you feel like you need some company. We're there for you, and we're happy to message with you and talk to you about what you're making in the pandemic. Thanks for hanging out with me. I will see you in a couple of weeks. Take care.